Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It really is a great pleasure to be here today, as I've known Shafiq for almost 20 years now. So I've really had the honor and the great pleasure of being involved with this process from the beginning, if I may say that. I count a few of these paintings as my babies, and we've acquired them together in a wonderful way over the years. So as I say, I had the honor of seeing this develop from the beginning with Shafiq, and him buying it initially, I think, as he said, for 3 years, traveling the world, learning for his own pleasure, buying starting in '93, typical of Shafiq to research and think everything through before he goes ahead. Then for many years, we all know, it's a selfish, naughty pleasure, but owning art is one of the most wonderful things possible. And he then thinks, how can I help others with that? So first he moves on, does these extraordinary volumes of the collection that he's done that we've now seen. And to take this even further, which again is so typical of Shafiq and his generosity and wanting to help the world in really any way possible, is now what's going to happen is how many lives this is going to affect in the future for the students, for the artists. We're starting with a few. I can only imagine, A, how it's going to enhance their lives, but then the knock-on effect and the domino effect of how what they do will affect that many others. So it is such an interesting process, because stemming from that, I just want to talk about what's already been happening and how this is kind of the next stage. I want to talk more from the market perspective and the museum perspective and what's been happening and how art has really now been enhancing the world, because we had, of course, the 19th century Orientalists, which was wonderful to see, but they were really more, and as much as we all have a great passion for those pictures, as we know, they were the European and the Western artists that were actually going to the Middle East and painting, in a sense, the idealized vision of what was going on out there. And before the internet and everything else, that was so much of how the West saw the great exotica. Now, we don't have that so much. What we actually have for Middle Eastern art is literally Middle Eastern art. We have the Middle Eastern artists who have started there, and this great diaspora that's really develops, because so many of these artists now on the East, they go to the West. It's very strange this. They bring their art to the West, and somehow the Middle East, sorry, not that they don't bring their art to the West, they've actually traveled to the West. They've grown up, many of the artists, which I'll touch on in a moment. So they have that background to them. They come to the West, they make these extraordinary works, which now, in other ways, go back to the East, where they're sold. And incredibly, the West now is taking notice because of some extraordinary prices that's going on there. There's this continual cross-fertilization of ideas and this cultural and aesthetic movement really across the world now, which we haven't really seen before. This is happened in a lot of ways with certain events and projects that have developed. One of the most interesting ones, I think, is Art Dubai, which I've watched develop over sort of 6 or 7 years now. It's run by an extraordinary English woman called Antonia Carver. And what happened there, which I thought was so interesting to see, is we had a lot of the Western galleries go and think, oh, well, we can take anything they want, anyone will buy here, there's so much money, it doesn't really matter. And of course, the East just turned their nose up to that. So what they then started doing was the Eastern galleries came in, and then the year after that, the Western galleries came back with their Middle Eastern artists that they were representing. So now Art Dubai is extraordinary sort of finger on the pulse of what's going on in the Middle Eastern art world. And what Antonia has done is built such an amazing program of events and sort of symposium and lectures, and at the same time also then we have the Sharjah Biennial often every other year. She takes tours to Doha, and most importantly is last year they had 75 museum groups going. 75, including groups from, which I'll touch on in a moment, the Tate, the British Museum, of course, which is something we've had here for quite a long time, the association with the Middle East and the British Museum, but also so many from America and so many from California and so many people that wouldn't have made this trip otherwise and really want to understand what's going on in the Middle East. That does also bring me back to the Tate, who about 5 years ago now founded their Middle Eastern Acquisitions Committee, which is something that didn't exist before as well, which is an extraordinary thing for the Tate and in the West to do, as well as the British Museum. Also, they kind of try not to step on each other's toes. They work together with their acquisitions, but it's a wonderful thing to have here, of course, brought to the West. And we have Christie's, who have been putting on events of Middle Eastern art there for, I think this is their 12th sale they just had, it's about 6 years. Again, dare I say it, it's a little bit commercially driven in the sense that there have been some extraordinary prices there. We had an auction of Egyptian, well, Sheikh Mohammed Farsi, who was the mayor of Jeddah, thank you very much, for many years. And he collected in the 70s, he collected an unbelievable collection, extremely rare, really sort of great foresight, of Egyptian artists between the sort of 20s and 50s, 60s. And when these works came up, the museums couldn't help themselves, the Middle Eastern museums in particular, because there's just no really collection like it. And we had works that were estimated 400,000, making $2.6 million. And when you have headlines like that, people take notice, and they do actually think, well, what is this art? That even if that's the way they're going to be drawn to it, what is this, and what is happening in the Middle East, and who are these artists? And it does draw this kind of cross-cultural dialogue, because you may look at it in a commercial sense, but then it would look to it in the more academic sense, the more museum sense. It will draw you to more exhibitions. It really, in a sense, if that's the way it's going to be, it does put a lot of the Middle Eastern art on the map. Another really wonderful initiative has been the Edge of Arabia, which is a touring exhibition for several years now, mostly of Saudi Arabian artists, a little on the more political side, but something, again, that is going to various cities around the world and drawing huge attention. And of course, there is the wonderful Institut du Monde Arabe, which has been in Paris now for since 1980. So incredible vision there. And lastly, though, my heart is still very much in the 19th century. So I did want to just, as a final comment, talk about how the 19th century Orientalist artists are affecting the art that's being developed now. Not as much as one might think. There are a few artists. I love Lala Asadi, who, again, in the great diaspora, she's a Moroccan artist who is now in Brooklyn. She does a lot of these wonderful photographs with beautiful models with calligraphy written all over them that Shafiq has actually told me is gobbledygook, but it looks like it. And they're based very much on 19th century poses of the figures in harems, and they're absolutely beautiful. And she, for example, just had a great exhibition at the Smithsonian in Washington. There's another wonderful Iraqi artist called Haif Kamran, who does, again, these kind of sensual, languorous, but very angular and 21st century harems, if you could call it that. And she is Iraqi. She now lives in San Francisco via Sweden, which is where she grew up. We also now, for the 19th century, which hadn't happened for a long time for the Orientalists, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, we have this extraordinary Orientalist room, which really warmed the cockles of my heart to see, because there hadn't been really that emphasis on it before. And I think it's so interesting that it's sponsored by Kenny Lane, who is a great collector of his own, but also the great costume jewelry magnate. And I'd like to think perhaps there's some costume jewelry out there that's based on some of the beautiful objects in some of these pictures. And finally, I was in the Musée d'Orsay the other day, and there as well, I couldn't actually believe to see that there is now an Orientalist room, although it's got one of the great holdings. They'd never actually put it together and focused on the Middle East in such a way. And when I was there, I saw this, I think it was English or American, and he had his little 5-year-old son, and he was running by, and they were obviously going to next to him, and he turned his head and he said, "Oh, look, Orientalism. I love Orientalism. Come, let's look at these pictures." And I thought, isn't that wonderful? You know, I'm sure that this 5-year-old child, or however when he grows up, will have that thought in his head and that influence, and hopefully be saying the same thing to his children.